the Chinese Communist Party using underhanded means to pressure other countries and their economies to become dependent on the CCP regime. This was the subject of a congressional hearing earlier today. NTD's Jack Bradley brings us more.
The Chinese regime's economic coercion, coupled with its expanding surveillance, is causing increasing concern among America and its allies. At a hearing today by the Foreign Affairs Committee, members of Congress examined the economic threat of China's hold on critical minerals to produce semiconductors, something highly important to the American economy and military.
They are an adversary, and that in not only the Indo-China Sea, but throughout the Pacific, and they obviously are aligned with Russia in the Ukrainian war, and continue to make threats toward Taiwan.
I believe that trade is important as long as it's conditioned on human rights respect. I chair the China Commission. We focused on this horrific practice of forced organ harvesting. It's my third hearing on that. I have a bill that passed bipartisan, sitting over in the Senate since March 28th of last year. Only 2 people in the whole House voted against it, to really rein in on an egregious practice. Everywhere you look, name the human rights abuse, Xi Jinping is excelling in it, and of course he's threatening Taiwan.
Over 300,000 Chinese national students are at our top universities with unfettered access, as their scientists have been admitting to American technologies in AI and hypersonic development, things that can be used and weaponized against us. Some of the most transformative technologies we've ever seen in human history are being stolen from us.
Some members of Congress blame the economic woes on the Biden administration's policies, bringing up the recent pause on new American liquefied natural gas exports.
The President's recent decision to ban LNG export permits is a perfect example of a policy that harms U.S. business interests and U.S. foreign policy.
The war on fossil fuel is real, and it's costing us, every American family, dollars at the pump, and it's going up. This fantasy executive order, or a rule that wants to make a huge percentage of our cars electric by 2032, it's fantasy. The grid won't handle it.
As the U.S. works to counter the Chinese Communist Party's economic influence, it's clear that most officials here agree that more needs to be done. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
And turning back to some rather disturbing news back here in the nation's capital, from carjackings to homicides, Washington, D.C. is seeing a dramatic rise in violent crime over the past year, especially in Ward 6, which includes Capitol Hill. NTD's Sam Wong spoke with D.C. residents to find out what they think about the city's public safety epidemic.
2023 was a turbulent year for Capitol Hill staffers.
In September, I hosted a security briefing where we heard from 2 staff members who were mugged at gunpoint just down the street.
Located at the heart of Washington, D.C., Ward 6 is considered a relatively affluent and safe part of town. This area not only covers federal landmarks like the U.S. Capitol, it's also home to a growing number of residential and commercial buildings. But the safety situation has been eroding in recent years. In 2023, Ward 6 saw a 188% increase in homicides, 57% increase in carjacking, and 44% increase in violent crime. That's according to the chairman of the D.C. Police Union, who testified at a congressional hearing Thursday. He said law enforcement officers are stepping down at a record pace due to anti-police laws and rhetoric coming from the city council.
Since the beginning of 2020, the MPD has lost 1,426 officers, more than 1/3 of the department. 540 of those separations, nearly 40%, were resignations.
I asked some D.C. residents if they feel safe living in the city. Here's what they said.
Crime is pretty much targeted and limited to certain populations that are disadvantaged.
The reason why people are not feeling safe because the crime that's happening is happening near affluent neighborhoods now.
Janae is a hairstylist who lives near the Capitol. She told me someone once tried to break into her home while her teenage daughter was there alone. To Janae, safety has become more than just a see you later conversation. It's now a demand.
I have a teenage daughter, and it's like as soon as she gets out of school, I'm like, okay, as soon as you get home, call me.
This is like a relatively safe neighborhood.
Supposedly.
While many other major cities saw downturns in violent crimes, D.C. saw a 36% jump in homicides last year, and carjacking nearly doubled. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Sam Wang, NTD News.
A congressional hearing yesterday shedding light on the Chinese Communist regime's practice of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, namely Falun Gong practitioners. Yet these atrocities haven't received widespread media coverage in the United States, and perhaps there are greater reasons behind this. Joining me now to explore this issue is Larry Liu, Deputy Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. Dr. Larry Liu, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Dr. Liu, yesterday there was a very important hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday there with Congressman Chris Smith. He was spearheading this Congressional Executive Committee on China hearing focusing on organ harvesting. A large focus was against these crimes against humanity taking place on Falun Gong practitioners. Why has this issue, as serious as it is, been so underreported in your opinion?
Very good question. I think we just published a report on New York Times past 25 years coverage on Falun Gong, and as an agenda-setting paper, and I think New York Times played a major role in this silence on this very important issue. Let me just give you one example. China Tribunal, which is independent tribunal based in London, which was led by Sir Jeffrey Nice, who was the lead prosecutor of Milosevic in 1990s. And they spent a year investigating this forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience, starting from 2019. And then in 2019, they received a testimony from a former New York Times Beijing correspondent, Didi Kirsten-Tallow. And in the testimony, she said that in 2016, she had a lunch with Chinese surgeons, transplant surgeons, and she can speak Chinese fluently. And she overheard their conversation, which indicate that it's a common knowledge among Chinese surgeons that organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience are happening, and they're not even aware of the Chinese government's so-called pronounced ban of using organs from executed prisoners. Then she wanted to pursue that story and do further investigation on organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. But New York Times editor told her that, no, there's nothing there. Chinese government already said they stopped using organs from executed prisoners and then stopped there. They suppress her from pursuing the story. So, and then, in 2020, and the China Tribunal released their full judgment and concluded that forced organ harvesting has been going on for years in China on a large scale, and Falun Gong has been one and probably the main organ supply, and many dozens of international media reported, but New York Times keeps silent.
So, Dr. Liu, we're talking about America, if not the world's preeminent news publication. Many people rely on the New York Times for their daily source of news. So if you could, tell us, you mentioned the undercoverage that the New York Times has given to Falun Gong. Tell us how the New York Times actual reporting, you mentioned it just briefly there, specifically of Falun Gong, has differed from other media, and perhaps why.
In terms of comparison with other media, I want to just point out the difference between New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. In the first 2 years of persecution, starting from 1999 to 2001, Wall Street Journal did a series of 10 articles, on the human toll of the persecution, the state-sanctioned torture, and they won the Pulitzer Prize. It's great, groundbreaking reporting. They won the Pulitzer Prize deservedly. And the Washington Post did also a few underground investigations. For example, they debunked the false self-immolation hoax propagated by the CCP, and they also point out that the architecture of the persecution campaign, and point out that Jiang Zemin, the then communist leader and who single-handedly started the persecution, and he ordered Falun Gong to be labeled a cult a few months after the persecution started, retroactively. And Washington Post also published an article on the structure of the persecution campaign, and they documented a three-pronged strategy in the persecution campaign. One is a demonizing campaign against Falun Gong, the other is state-sanctioned torture, the other is brainwash. But New York Times did nothing of that depth and caliber. They like underground investigation, and most of their story on Falun Gong were driven by some of the CCP statement or some of the highly visible protest. So it's very shallow.
Deputy Director of Falun Dafa Info Center, Dr. Larry Liu, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me.
And for more information on the persecution of Falun Gong in the New York Times underreporting of this issue, you can visit the Falun Dafa Info Center website at faluninfo.net. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.